December 7th, 1941. 6 minutes before 8 in the morning, the first Japanese bombs fall on Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans are dead. 21 warships lie sunk or damaged along Battleship Row. The pride of the Pacific Fleet burns in the shallow Hawaiian waters. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo meets with Vice Minister of the Home Ministry, Mitio Yuzawa, just hours before the attack. His words, preserved in a memo made public in 2018, reveal astonishing confidence. "I am completely relieved," Tojo declares. "Given the current conditions, I could say we have practically won already." He was catastrophically wrong. Japan lost the Pacific War before firing a single shot, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of leaders who convinced themselves that a nation of soft individualists would never sustain a fight 5,000 miles from home. This was the costliest intelligence failure of the 20th century. Japanese military planners possessed accurate data on American industrial capacity, yet dismissed it, believing spiritual superiority and racial unity would triumph over factories and oil fields. The result was a war that destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy, leveled 67 Japanese cities, and killed over 2 million Japanese military personnel. A catastrophe rooted in cultural arrogance, historical misanalogy, and a fundamental misreading of the American character. This is the story of how Japan misjudged America and how that misjudgment led to total national destruction. Japanese pre-war assessments of the United States rested on a toxic combination of accurate industrial data and wildly inaccurate cultural assumptions. The prevailing view among Japanese leadership characterized Americans as loud, vulgar, materialistic, and shallow, a civilization that lacked spiritual and cultural dimensions. Japanese intellectuals and military officers alike believed American society was fundamentally decadent, its people obsessed with comfort and pleasure rather than duty and sacrifice. One American diplomat stationed in pre-war Nagoya reported that while Japanese elites genuinely admired American industrial and scientific achievements, they had very little appreciation for American cultural or spiritual attainments. The average American was seen as technically skillful but intellectually underdeveloped, pleasure-seeking, and incapable of collective sacrifice. American movies reinforced this perception, depicting a society consumed by entertainment, luxury, and individual pursuits rather than national purpose. Two ideological pillars reinforced this view. Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, held that the Japanese possessed a unique spiritual superiority that could overcome any material disadvantage. This was not mere propaganda, but deeply held belief, rooted in centuries of cultural tradition and reinforced by the Meiji-era's successful modernization. The Japanese had transformed their nation from feudal isolation to world power in a single generation through sheer willpower and collective determination. Surely, the reasoning went, that same spirit could overcome American materialism. Bushido, the warrior code, provided the second pillar. It dictated that death was preferable to surrender, a conviction that made Japanese planners assume their enemies lacked equivalent resolve. Japanese soldiers trained to die for their emperor. American soldiers, they believed, fought for money and comfort and would flee when the fighting became serious. British historian H.P. Wilmot identified the core belief that animated Japanese strategic thinking. Japan was a nation created by and watched over by the gods and ruled by a god. This religious dimension provided the basis for the belief in the superiority of the Japanese martial commitment, Yamato Damashi. That was the guarantee against national defeat. In Japanese thinking, Americans might have more factories, more ships, more aircraft, but they lacked the soul of a warrior nation. Spirit, in the final analysis, would triumph over steel. History appeared to validate these convictions. Japan had defeated China in 1895, seizing Taiwan and establishing dominance in Korea. More remarkably, Japan had defeated Russia in 1905, despite being materially weaker. The Russo-Japanese War proved that an Asian nation could defeat a European great power through superior fighting spirit and strategic audacity. The victory over Russia was particularly seductive as a model for war with America. A surprise naval attack at Port Arthur had crippled the Russian Pacific Fleet before war was even declared. The subsequent land campaign in Manchuria had been brutal and costly, but Japan had prevailed through tenacity and willingness to accept casualties that would have broken a softer nation. The decisive Battle of Tsushima had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet after its 18,000-mile journey to the Pacific, a victory so complete that it remains one of the most one-sided naval engagements in history. Most importantly, Russia had sued for peace. The larger, wealthier, more populous power had concluded that victory was not worth the cost and had negotiated terms favorable to Japan. Japanese planners in 1941 explicitly modeled their strategy on this precedent. They would launch a surprise attack to cripple American naval power. They would seize a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific. They would inflict casualties so severe that Americans, soft and comfort-loving, would calculate that retaking distant colonial possessions was simply not worth the blood and treasure required. America would negotiate, just as Russia had. American racial diversity was viewed as a critical weakness that Russia had not possessed. Where Japan saw racial homogeneity as a source of national strength, a single people united by blood and culture and emperor, America's immigrant population was interpreted as proof the country would fracture under pressure. How could a nation of Germans and Irish and Italians and Jews and Africans, people who shared no common ancestry and no common faith, possibly unite for prolonged sacrifice? American democracy was seen as producing indecisiveness, factional squabbling, and an inability to sustain prolonged sacrifice. Democracies, Japanese strategists believed, were inherently weak in war because their leaders had to answer to public opinion rather than acting decisively. Not every Japanese leader shared this delusion. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and the man who would plan the Pearl Harbor attack, spent years in America and knew better than anyone how dangerous these assumptions were. Yamamoto studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, improving his English and studying American culture and industry. He served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, traveling extensively through the American heartland. He visited Detroit's automobile factories and Texas's oil fields.
He became an avid poker player, a game that taught him about calculated risk, bluffing, and knowing when you were beaten. What he saw in America terrified him. Unlike his colleagues in Tokyo, who knew America only through diplomatic cables and intelligence reports, Yamamoto had walked American streets, spoken with American workers, and seen American industry firsthand. He understood that the cheerful American consumer society masked enormous latent power. Those automobile factories could become tank factories. Those oil fields could fuel a fleet larger than anything Japan could imagine. Those casual, informal Americans, who seemed so undisciplined, could, when roused, display determination that matched any samurai. His warnings were blunt and specific. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America, he told colleagues. To a group of school children in 1940, he said simply, "Japan cannot beat America, therefore Japan should not fight America." These were not idle concerns from a timid man, but the considered judgment of Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. In what became his most famous verified statement, Yamamoto warned Prime Minister Fumimaru Kono in late 1940 of exactly what war with America would bring. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." This quote, preserved in Kenoi's memoir, proved devastatingly prophetic. The Battle of Midway, Japan's first catastrophic defeat, occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had predicted his own failure with uncanny precision. Yamamoto also made what appeared to be a boast, but was actually a warning about the impossibility of victory. In a letter to politician Ryoichi Sasakawa, dated January 24, 1941, he wrote, "Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House." He meant this not as confident prediction, but as proof of impossibility. Total conquest of the continental United States was obviously impossible. Therefore, total victory was impossible. Therefore, war should be avoided. Yet Yamamoto's dissent changed nothing. The army dominated Japanese politics, and the army wanted war. Yamamoto was sent to sea as combined fleet commander, partly to protect him from militarist assassins who opposed his anti-war stance. Ultraist fanatics had already assassinated several prominent opponents of war. When conflict became inevitable, despite his warnings, Yamamoto concluded that if it had to be fought, he could not see anyone but himself in charge of it. He conceived the Pearl Harbor strike as a desperate gamble to buy time, not to win outright, a knockout blow that might, just might, give Japan enough breathing room to consolidate gains before American industrial power could be brought to bear. One famous quote deserves clarification because it is almost certainly fiction. The line, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," appears in countless documentaries and history books attributed to Yamamoto. It first appeared in the 1970 film Tora Tora Tora. Director Richard Fleischer said producer Elmo Williams attributed it to Yamamoto's diary, but Yamamoto never kept a diary. The screenwriter claimed to have found it in a 1943 letter, but could never produce the document. Historians Donald Goldstein of the University of Pittsburgh and others have concluded there is no evidence Yamamoto ever said it. It captures his sentiment perfectly, which is perhaps why it has proven so durable, but it is Hollywood dialogue, not historical record. The closest authenticated statement is from a January 9, 1942 letter to editor Ogata Takura, written just a month after Pearl Harbor. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten.
Even in victory, Yamamoto felt no triumph, only foreboding. The December 1, 1941 Imperial Conference that approved war against the United States rested on 5 interconnected assumptions. Every one of them proved wrong. First, Japanese leaders believed American isolationism was deeply rooted and would persist even after an attack. They noted the America First movement, the reluctance of Congress to arm, the widespread desire to stay out of foreign wars. Surely, an attack in the distant Pacific would not reverse these sentiments. Second, they assumed the war would be fought too far from the American mainland for citizens to sustain interest. The Philippines and Guam meant nothing to Kansas farmers or New York factory workers. Why would they sacrifice their sons for islands they could not find on a map? Third, they expected that destroying the Pacific Fleet would eliminate American power projection for 12 to 18 months, during which Japan could consolidate a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians through Midway to Wake to the Marshalls to the Gilberts to Rabaul to the Dutch East Indies to Burma. This defensive ring would be so costly to penetrate that America would accept the fait accompli rather than pay the price to reverse it. Fourth, they believed Germany would keep Britain and the United States occupied in Europe. The Atlantic would demand American attention. Japan would face only a portion of American power, and that portion divided across 2 oceans. Fifth, and most critically, they assumed Americans, unwilling to sustain heavy casualties for distant colonial possessions that had never mattered to them before, would negotiate peace on terms favorable to Japan, just as Russia had in 1905. Meanwhile, Chief of Naval Staff Admiral Osamu Nagano articulated the fatalism that pervaded Japanese decision-making in those final days before war. Since Japan is unavoidably facing national ruin, whether it decides to fight or not, it must, by all means, choose to fight. Japan would rather go down fighting than ignobly surrender without a struggle, because surrender would spell spiritual as well as physical ruin. This was not strategic thinking. It was fatalistic acceptance of probable disaster, combined with hope that spirit might somehow prevail. As historian Ari Hotter concluded, after exhaustive archival research, when Japan attacked the United States in 1941, its leaders, in large part, understood they were entering a war they were almost certain to lose. The speed of Japan's initial conquests exceeded even its own optimistic projections. In 6 months, the Japanese Empire expanded to encompass roughly 1/7 of the globe's surface. From the frozen Aleutian Islands in the north to the steaming jungles of New Guinea in the south. From the border of India in the west to the approaches to Hawaii in the east. Japanese planners had expected to lose 1/4 of their forces in the initial offensives. Actual losses were negligible. Victory disease. The Japanese called it senu, and it infected every level of command. The timeline was devastating for the Allies. Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, killed over 2,400 Americans and sank or damaged 21 ships, including 8 battleships that represented the backbone of American Pacific naval power. Guam fell on December 10th after just hours of fighting. Its garrison of approximately 550 personnel had only about 100 rifles, no artillery, no aircraft. They never had a chance. Wake Island held heroically for 16 days, a tiny garrison of Marines and civilian construction workers fighting against overwhelming odds. On December 11th, Wake's defenders repulsed the first Japanese amphibious assault, shore batteries and Marine Wildcats sinking the destroyers Hayate and Kisaragi and damaging other vessels. It was the only time in the Pacific War that an amphibious landing was repelled. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham's message captured the desperate final hours when a massively reinforced Japanese force returned. Enemy on island, issue in doubt. Wake fell on December 23rd, but its resistance had delayed the Japanese timetable and inflicted losses that embarrassed Tokyo. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942, with approximately 85,000 Allied and Commonwealth troops surrendering, the largest capitulation in British history. The British had built Singapore as an impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the East, and Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had captured it in 70 days, attacking down the Malay Peninsula from the north, while British guns pointed uselessly out to sea. The Java Sea Battle on February 27th destroyed Allied naval power in Southeast Asia in a 7-hour engagement that killed 2,300 Allied sailors against just 36 Japanese. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil fields that Japan desperately needed, formally surrendered on March 9th. The Philippines produced the largest American surrender in history. After 3 months of desperate resistance on the Bataan Peninsula, where troops on half rations suffered from malaria, dysentery, and beriberi, where fewer than half were considered combat effective, Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops on April 9, 1942. The subsequent Bataan Death March killed an estimated 500 to 650 Americans and between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipinos, over 65 miles of forced marching in tropical heat without adequate food or water. Corregidor, the fortress island at the mouth of Manila Bay, fell on May 6th. General Jonathan Wainwright would remain a prisoner until 1945.
These victories reinforced every Japanese assumption. American forces had surrendered by the tens of thousands.
British forces had surrendered by the tens of thousands. Dutch forces had surrendered. The supposedly invincible white colonial powers had crumbled at the first serious challenge. By March 1942, Japanese military leadership concluded their war plans had been too conservative and pessimistic. Perhaps spirit really could triumph over material. What emerged was victory disease in its full malignancy, a syndrome of arrogance, complacency, rigid adherence to proven tactics, and dismissal of the enemy's capacity to adapt or improve. Yet even in defeat, the Allies had shown something that Japanese planners refused to recognize. The Bataan defense had delayed Japan's timetable by months, forcing the diversion of reinforcements meant for other operations. Wake Island's Marines had inflicted the only successful repulse of a Japanese landing in the entire initial offensive. These were early signals that American and Allied fighting quality had been underestimated, signals Japan chose to ignore in the flush of victory. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from USS Hornet approximately 650 miles from Japan. It was the first time medium bombers had ever flown from a carrier deck in combat, an improvisation that seemed impossible until American audacity made it real. 80 volunteer airmen flew what they knew was essentially a one-way mission. The bombers could not land back on the carrier. They would strike Japan and continue on to China, hoping to reach friendly territory before their fuel ran out. Physical damage to Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe was minimal. A few dozen buildings destroyed, roughly 50 Japanese killed, but the psychological impact was seismic. For America, it was a morale lifeline during the war's darkest period. In the months after Pearl Harbor, with defeat following defeat across the Pacific, Americans desperately needed proof that they could strike back. Doolittle gave them that proof. The headlines announced that American bombs had fallen on the Japanese capital itself. The details did not matter. The symbolism was everything. For Japan, the raid exposed homeland defense as a fiction and embarrassed the military leadership who had promised the emperor that his sacred person would never be endangered by enemy attack. 4 Army fighter groups were retained in the home islands for air defense, even though desperately needed in the South Pacific. This diversion of resources would cost Japan dearly in the battles to come. Most critically, the Doolittle raid convinced the Japanese army, which had previously opposed Admiral Yamamoto's plan to attack Midway, to support the operation. Yamamoto had long wanted to draw the American carriers into a decisive battle where Japanese superiority in numbers and skill could destroy them. The army had resisted, seeing it as an unnecessary risk. But after American bombers appeared over Tokyo, the army could no longer argue that the American carrier threat was tolerable. The rushed, overconfident Midway operation that followed led directly to Japan's worst naval disaster. Yamamoto had predicted exactly this vulnerability before the war. If the Americans really made up their mind to wade in on us, he had warned, there would be no way of defending a city like Tokyo. The Doolittle raiders proved him right. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4th through 7th, 1942, was the Pacific War's decisive turning point, and it came almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, just as Yamamoto had predicted. The Americans should not have won. Yamamoto brought 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, and over 250 aircraft to the battle. The Americans had 3 carriers, no battleships, and roughly 230 aircraft. Japanese pilots were combat veterans with years of experience. Many American pilots had never seen combat. By every conventional metric, Japan should have achieved the decisive victory Yamamoto sought. But the Americans had broken the Japanese naval code.
Commander Joseph Rochefort's Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had penetrated the JN-25B cipher, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz something Yamamoto did not know he lacked: accurate intelligence about Japanese intentions. Nimitz knew Yamamoto's target, timing, and force composition. He knew that the Japanese fleet would approach Midway from the northwest. He knew approximately when the attack would come. When Washington doubted that the target was actually Midway, Lieutenant Jasper Holmes of the Station Hypo staff devised an ingenious confirmation. The Midway garrison sent an unencrypted message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Japanese intelligence was intercepted shortly after reporting that AF, the Japanese designator for their target, is short of water. The target was confirmed. Nimitz could commit his forces with confidence. He committed virtually everything the U.S. Navy had in the Pacific. 3 carriers, including the Yorktown, that had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that the Japanese believed her sunk. Pearl Harbor shipyard workers had performed miracles, completing 3 months of repairs in just 72 hours. Yorktown sailed to Midway, held together by emergency welds and determination. It was a massive gamble, based largely on intelligence. If Rochefort was wrong, the Pacific Fleet would sail into a trap. The battle's pivotal minutes came at approximately 10:20 in the morning on June 4, 1942, when SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived above Admiral Nagumo's carriers, essentially unopposed at high altitude. Waves of American torpedo bombers had been slaughtered in the preceding hours. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft, all 30 crew members killed, except for Ensign George Gay, who floated in the water and watched what happened next. But their sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, chasing slow, vulnerable torpedo planes that posed no actual threat because their torpedoes were defective and poorly aimed. When the dive bombers arrived from high altitude, no Japanese fighters were in position to intercept. Below Nagumo's carrier decks was crowded chaos. Aircraft were being rearmed and refueled. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. The Japanese were preparing a strike against the American carriers that Nagumo had just learned were in the area, a discovery that had thrown his plans into confusion. The dive bombers struck 3 carriers within minutes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were fatally hit. Their flight decks turned into infernos as fuel and ammunition exploded. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, escaped the initial attack and launched a counterstrike that found and damaged Yorktown. But American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and sent her to the bottom as well. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, along with a heavy cruiser, more than 300 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 personnel. These were not merely ships and planes, but irreplaceable trained mechanics, armorers, and flight deck crews who had taken years to develop. America lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. The Japanese Navy, in concert with Emperor Hirohito, orchestrated an elaborate cover-up. Midway was announced to the Japanese public as a victory. Sunken carriers remained on the Navy's roster as unmanned. Wounded sailors were sequestered in separate hospitals, with family visits prohibited to prevent word from spreading. Healthy survivors were transferred to distant commands where they could not talk about what had happened. The Japanese people would not learn the truth about Midway until after the war. Nagumo was found by his chief of staff, seemingly contemplating suicide. Yamamoto canceled the operation and retreated to his cabin, ill. His 6-month prediction had proven exact. The period during which Japan could run wild was over. 2 months later, the Guadalcanal campaign began in the steaming Solomon Islands, and it shocked Japanese assumptions about American fighting quality even more profoundly than Midway had shocked their confidence at sea.
If Midway proved that Japan could lose at sea, Guadalcanal proved that Americans could fight on land with a ferocity that matched anything Japanese soldiers could deliver.
When the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandergrift, landed on August 7, 1942, it was America's first major amphibious offensive of the war. The target was a half-completed Japanese airfield on an obscure island that most Americans had never heard of. That airfield, renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, became the campaign's center of gravity for 6 brutal months. Japanese commanders repeatedly underestimated American strength and resolve. Colonel Kona Ichiki landed 916 men on August 21st, expecting to overwhelm what intelligence told him was a small, demoralized garrison. In a savage night battle along the Tanaru River, Marines annihilated his force. Approximately 800 Japanese were killed against 150 American casualties. Ichiki himself burned his regimental colors and died in the fighting, possibly by his own hand. Admiral Riso Tanaka, one of Japan's most capable officers, later reflected that this tragedy should have taught us the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics. It did not. The Japanese military could not accept that American troops had outfought elite Japanese soldiers in close combat. There must have been some other explanation. Perhaps Ichiki's force was too small. Perhaps they attacked in the wrong place. Surely more troops would succeed where fewer had failed. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 6,000-man assault at Edson's Ridge in September was defeated with over 50% casualties. The climactic battle for Henderson Field from October 23rd through 26th saw Japanese forces hurl themselves against Marine and Army positions in wave after wave of frontal assault. The direct assault force under General Maruyama numbered approximately 7,000 troops. The defenders sustained approximately 60 killed, while inflicting between 1,500 and 3,000 Japanese dead. During this battle, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns against approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers of the Sendai Regiment. For 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food, he kept his guns firing. When one section was destroyed, he carried a 90-pound machine gun 200 yards under fire to replace it. When ammunition ran out, he fought through Japanese lines with a pistol and machete to resupply his men. He became the first enlisted Marine in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. His words afterward captured both modesty and devotion to his comrades. Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal. He later refused an officer's commission and a stateside posting. I ain't no officer and I ain't no museum piece. I belong back with my outfit. He requested return to combat and was killed on Iwo Jima's first day, leading a machine gun section against a Japanese blockhouse. He earned a posthumous Navy Cross. He remains the only enlisted Marine in history to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Japanese Captain Toshikazu Omi, writing in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings after the war, identified what the campaign revealed about American technological advantage. The outstanding feature in the Guadalcanal campaign was the employment of radar by the United States, which completely reversed the Japanese Navy's traditional superiority in night engagements. The fact that the Japanese lost confidence in night engagements was a bad influence on the morale of the men. Japanese renamed Guadalcanal Starvation Island, a bitter pun on its Japanese pronunciation. Japanese troops died by the thousands, not from American bullets, but from disease and malnutrition, as American air power and naval forces strangled their supply lines. When Japan finally evacuated 11,000 survivors in February 1943, it had lost approximately 25,000 to 31,000 troops killed, approximately 680 aircraft destroyed, and 38 naval vessels sunk. Most of the Pearl Harbor veteran pilots who survived Midway perished in the Solomons air campaigns, an irreplaceable loss of expertise that crippled Japanese naval aviation. The most devastating miscalculation underlying all of Japan's failures was industrial. Japanese planners possessed the data. They knew American factories, steel production, and shipyard capacity dwarfed their own. What they could not conceive was the speed and scale at which America would convert its peacetime economy into a war machine, or the willingness of American society to sustain that effort year after year. The numbers are staggering and explain everything that followed. In 1937, according to historian Paul Kennedy's analysis in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, the United States held 41.7% of the world's total war-making potential. Japan held 3.5%. The U.S. economy was roughly 10 times Japan's size, American steel production 5 times greater, coal production 7 times greater, and automobile production 80 times greater. The U.S. also had 10 million unemployed workers from the Depression, massive slack capacity waiting to be mobilized. When mobilization came, it exceeded anything Japan's planners had modeled. In 1941, America produced over 3.6 million civilian automobiles. After Pearl Harbor, civilian production essentially ceased. Only 139 civilian cars were manufactured in 1943, and approximately 610 more in 1944. The entire American auto industry converted to war production with a speed that seemed impossible. The Ford Willow Run plant, the largest factory under one roof in history, with a mile-long assembly line, produced 8,685 B-24 Liberator bombers, eventually rolling one off the line every 63 minutes. Chrysler, which had never built a tank, constructed the Detroit Arsenal tank plant and became one of the largest tank producers in the world. By 1944, more than half of all industrial production in the world took place in the United States. The shipbuilding comparison tells the story most vividly for what was fundamentally a naval war. During the conflict, the United States built more than 150 aircraft carriers of all types, fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan built 17. America built 10 new battleships to Japan's 2. America built 349 destroyers to Japan's 63. America built 203 submarines to Japan's 167. In merchant shipping, America produced nearly 34 million tons compared to Japan's just over 4 million tons. The Liberty Ship program epitomized American industrial genius. Henry Kaiser shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. Early in the war, each ship took 355 days and 1.4 million man-hours to complete. By 1943, the average construction time had dropped to 41 days. The record, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. 250,000 parts, weighing 14 million pounds. Aircraft production was equally lopsided. The United States produced 324,730 aircraft during the war versus Japan's 76,320, a 4.3-to-1 ratio. But the most devastating statistic is this. In 1944 alone, American factories built 96,318 aircraft, more planes in a single year than Japan produced in the entire war. The quality gap widened simultaneously with the quantity gap. America continuously introduced superior designs. The F-6 Hellcat that dominated the Zero, the F-4 Corsair that terrorized Japanese airfields, the P-51 Mustang that ruled the skies. While Japan largely relied on variants of the A-6M0, which was clearly outclassed by 1943, Japanese aircraft designers knew their planes were falling behind, but lacked the industrial capacity to develop and produce new designs quickly enough to matter. Japanese intelligence estimates proved catastrophically wrong. Japan estimated U.S. Navy personnel strength at approximately 309,000 by late 1943. The actual number was 2.37 million, an underestimate by a factor of 7. Japan estimated American merchant ship construction at 5 million tons for 1943. The actual figure was 19.2 million tons. The pilot replacement crisis illustrated the industrial and training asymmetry most cruelly. At Pearl Harbor, the average Japanese naval pilot had over 700 hours of flight time, with many leaders exceeding 1,500.
If pilots were going to die anyway, they might as well die hitting something. Even the combined fleet's own post-war analysis demonstrated the fundamental futility of Japan's strategy. Had Japan won catastrophically at Midway, sinking all 3 American carriers while losing none of their own, the U.S. still would have achieved carrier parity by September 1943 and a 2-to-1 superiority by mid-1944. The industrial gap was simply too vast to overcome by any battlefield victory. The island-hopping campaign from late 1943 through 1945 demonstrated a relentless American learning curve that Japanese defenders could not match. Each costly battle produced rapid tactical adaptation that made the next assault more effective. Tarawa, in November 1943, was the brutal tutorial. Rear Admiral Kieiji Shibazaki boasted it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer his fortified atoll. Marines took it in 76 hours, but at horrific cost. 1,009 killed and 2,100 wounded in just over 3 days. Low tide stranded landing craft on coral reefs hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade through chest-deep water under withering fire. The lessons were immediately absorbed. The Navy created underwater demolition teams, precursors to the Navy SEALs, to scout beaches and clear obstacles. New armored amphibious tractors were developed. Pre-landing bombardment procedures were reformed. Reconnaissance protocols were completely overhauled. Saipan, in June and July 1944, pierced Japan's absolute national defense zone and put B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. The battle featured the war's largest banzai charge, approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers attacking in a 15-hour assault on July 7th, nearly annihilating 2 Army battalions before being killed almost to the last man. Of roughly 32,000 Japanese defenders, only 931 surrendered. Thousands of Japanese civilians died, with estimates ranging up to 22,000, including hundreds who leaped from seaside cliffs rather than face capture by Americans they had been told would torture and murder them. The fall of Saipan forced the resignation of Prime Minister Tojo, the war's architect, implicitly acknowledging that his assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. American bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands on a regular basis. The defensive perimeter had been pierced. The war Japan had hoped to avoid, a war of attrition against American industrial power, had arrived. Iwo Jima, in February and March 1945, showed that the Japanese had learned too, at least in defensive tactics. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribashi transformed 8 square miles of volcanic rock into 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting bunkers, artillery positions, and fighting positions. He forbade the wasteful banzai charges that had squandered Japanese lives in earlier battles, a radical departure from doctrine that his own officers initially resisted. The 36-day battle cost 6,821 total American dead, including nearly 6,000 Marines and roughly 19,000 wounded. Japanese losses were approximately 18,000 to 21,000 dead. It was one of the few Pacific battles where American total casualties exceeded the enemy's. Okinawa, in April through June 1945, was the campaign's terrible climax and a preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost.
The 82-day battle involved over 500,000 American personnel and produced more than 12,500 American dead and approximately 49,000 total casualties. Japanese kamikaze attacks at Okinawa launched approximately 2,000 aircraft in mass raids, damaging 368 Allied ships and sinking 36. The U.S. Navy suffered more casualties at Okinawa than in any previous engagement in its history. The super battleship Yamamoto, the largest warship ever built, soared on a one-way suicide mission with only enough fuel to reach Okinawa and was sunk by American aircraft before getting close. The progression from conventional defense to mass suicide tactics traced the arc of Japanese desperation. Banzai charges at Saipan, official adoption of kamikaze tactics in the Philippines, defense in depth, tunnels at Iwo Jima, massive kamikaze operations at Okinawa. By war's end, Japan had prepared more than 10,000 aircraft for kamikaze operations against an anticipated Allied invasion and announced Ichioku Jokusai, the doctrine of 100 million shattered jewels, the official willingness to sacrifice the entire Japanese population, including colonial subjects, in final resistance. The consequences of misjudging America were total. By summer 1945, the Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Japan's oil supply had collapsed more than 90% from its 1943 level. By April 1945, oil imports had ceased completely. American submarines and aircraft had destroyed the merchant fleet that connected Japan to its conquered territories. Ships were being built of wood because there was steel shortage. Military trucks burned charcoal because there was no gasoline. Pilots could not be trained because there was no aviation fuel. 67 Japanese cities had been bombed, many of them burned to ash. The March 9th and 10th, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo alone killed at least 83,000 people by official count, with many historians estimating the true toll exceeded 100,000, more than either atomic bombing. Approximately 40% of Japan's total urban area was destroyed. The 1945 rice harvest was the worst since 1909. Food availability dropped to 1,680 calories per day for industrial workers, a starvation diet. The American Strategic Bombing Survey, which deployed approximately 1,100 agents to Japan after surrender, systematically documented the scale of the miscalculation. Its investigators secured principal surviving Japanese records and interrogated top Army and Navy officers, government officials, industrialists, and political leaders. Their core finding was damning. Japanese military leaders did not think that America could instill a martial spirit in its populace. They had been catastrophically wrong. Tojo himself at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal on December 26, 1947, remained defiant but implicitly acknowledged the scope of error. When asked about Pearl Harbor, he replied simply, "Yes, I am responsible." He had earlier attempted suicide on September 11, 1945, shooting himself in the chest with a .32 caliber pistol but missing his heart. He was hanged on December 23, 1948. Prince Konoye, who had tried to arrange a direct summit with President Roosevelt in summer 1941 to prevent war, offered a revealing post-war admission. The Emperor and I and most of the cabinet were for acceptance of the American terms that we withdraw from China. But Tojo, with the backing of the military, violently opposed. Konoye took cyanide on December 16, 1945, the day before he was to report to prison as a suspected war criminal. Japan's misjudgment of America was not primarily an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination. Japanese leaders possessed accurate data about American industrial capacity. They knew the U.S. economy dwarfed their own. They were aware of the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, which authorized construction of an entire second American fleet. Yamamoto explicitly warned that fighting America was like fighting the whole world. The data was available. The conclusions drawn from it were catastrophically wrong. The error was threefold. First, Japanese leaders confused material comfort with spiritual weakness, assuming that a prosperous society could not also be a determined one. Pearl Harbor did not demoralize America. It unified the country with a fury that persisted until unconditional surrender. Second, they applied the Russo-Japanese War template to a fundamentally different adversary, failing to recognize that the United States in 1914 was not Tsarist Russia in 1904. It was a continental industrial superpower with a democratic government capable of mobilizing total national effort. Third, they projected their own cultural framework onto the enemy. Because Bushido valued the spirit of the warrior above material considerations, they assumed material superiority without equivalent spiritual commitment was meaningless. They were wrong on every count. The Manhattan Project stands as the final proof of how completely Japan misjudged American capabilities. The United States not only waged two simultaneous, large-scale conventional wars across two oceans, but also invested $2 billion and its best scientific minds in developing a revolutionary weapon that might or might not work. Funded essentially from the leftovers of its war effort, the atomic bomb was built by a nation that Japan had dismissed as too soft to fight.
Yamamoto saw it all coming. His final verified reflection written in a letter after Pearl Harbor deserves to close any account of this tragedy. Britain and America may have underestimated Japan somewhat, but from their point of view, it is like having one's hand bitten rather badly by a dog one was feeding. The mindless rejoicing at home is really deplorable. It makes me fear that the first blow at Tokyo will make them wilt on the spot. He was killed on April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid proved him right about Tokyo's vulnerability. American P-38 fighters, guided by broken Japanese codes, ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. His body was found still clutching his samurai sword, a relic of a martial tradition that had led his nation to ruin. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others who appreciate historical documentaries. Your support helps us continue creating content that brings important moments from history to life. Thank you for watching.